everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Some Drivel, a series of podcasts exploring tangents with awesome humans. And speaking of awesome humans, I am thrilled to be joined today by John Hanke from Greasepunk Paradise, an absolutely arresting, intriguing online web series that is kind of, still in development. I know it's still kind of cooking, but it's something absolutely for folks who haven't heard of it. You need to check this out. You need to keep an eye on what's going on here. John, first of all, thank you so much for joining us for this new episode. It's a pleasure to have you here. Can you give the folks listening just a Cliff Notes version of what Greasepunk is and kind of the elevator pitch almost of what this show is forming out to be?
Yeah, so Greasepunk Paradise is an up and coming animated webcomic series that is really playing to the heartstrings of nostalgia for those that have watched cartoons of the 80s and the 90s, Saturday morning cartoons where you just tune in and get completely lost in a world of characters. And I think that's the key word to Greasepunk Paradise is it's about people, it's characters, and that we are really trying to break the mold in terms of storytelling where it's not simple heroes and villains. It's
Mhm.
just a bunch of people in a situation where a lot of things can happen and anything is possible.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I feel like cultivating a really, creative and invested group, as much as the characters clearly, that's going to be a driving force of the narrative. You have definitely done that on the production side, particularly with your voice cast. And I know that very publicly you have spoken, in fact, just recently around your approach with AI usage, but also fair compensation for actors. Had there been something specific that informed your approach to that in terms of had there been perhaps, I know I've certainly been struck by moments where I see sometimes what not to do, what other companies are doing, and that can sometimes inform my approach, and that can be a very educational experience for me. Had there been something that informed your specific approach with the way that you compensate voice actors and want to cultivate a very inviting environment for your cast?
Absolutely. And that's probably one of the most important things for me is staying connected to the culture of the voice actors, the people who work in the industry, just whatever the creative side is. Um, I coming into this having no background in anything like this whatsoever. I work in information technology, which is about as far away as you can get from this stuff. Um, I just started listening and started engaging. And what are people saying? What are people saying that's important to them? What are the challenges that they're facing in the creative community? And I just look at ourselves every single time and say, well, what can we do? What can we do that's different, even if it's going completely in the opposite direction of everyone else?
Mm,
And I think, just like as an example with offering hazard pay for those strained performances for voice actors,
right.
asking people who've been in acting their entire careers, and they're like, yeah, it's there if you really fight for it. People don't want to give it necessarily just proactively. And it's like, well, that's really easy to give proactively. So we're just going to do it.
Yeah, because it is an active choice there, right?
It's
And
a
that's
choice. That's the key. Yeah.
yeah, and that's something I'm glad you touched on that too, because I know that in prior episodes with a member of your cast, Stephen Murray, who's we have our podcast Dulcet Tones together. Um, he and I have spoken about the importance of vocal health and
Yep.
the tendency, I think, for things like that to be forgotten, given that it's not a physical pursuit. But then I think that in itself is a misconception for a lot of people, is that they assume that voice actors are simply just using this. But
Yeah.
if you've ever had a peek into a behind the scenes experience, it's a physical expression of yourself when you're performing a character, and that can take its toll. So I think maybe that's also something I wanted to kind of dig in with you with, which is that this notion that a project like this, given the approach you're taking, how do you maintain its viability, given that that is there's going to be an associated cost with that. Now, obviously, we don't need to dig into specifics in terms of amounts, etc., but just in broad terms, how is there a bit of a push and pull there between the kind of creative enterprise you want to run versus the practicality of being able to deliver that?
Yeah. That's a really good question because I think the fact that we're a self-funded project really is what helps secure that viability. Um, I think for me personally, I always think of it in terms of value. You know, we so easily it's easy to get stuck into the idea of costs and dollars and, well, if I pay for this, this is what it's worth. And that's really
Right.
not true.
Right.
That's not true. What I pay for it is just the cost. What I receive is the value. And I've always received more value than I've paid for in anything that I've asked for from a creative person.
Right.
And I see that. And I think the thing is even now as these different components are coming together, other people are seeing that too. That this is really standing out to be worth all the money that's gone into it and then some.
Mm. Well, that's must be a real challenge there that I think actually it's funny because when we were speaking about this before, just off air, the way you're running things reminds me a little bit of the streaming service Dropout with Game
Yeah.
Changer and those guys over there,
Yep.
in that they have very publicly talked about their compensation for actors being slightly above scale, but also just the notion of the way they greenlight projects and the way they invite people in. It's very inclusive, but it's only supported really by subscriptions to their subscription model, and then about 10, Sam Reich, the CEO, mentioned that it was about 10% merch, right? And but
Right.
that proportionally it was coming from direct investment, and in the case of what you've said here is that it's self-funded. It's something that you are choosing to bet on essentially. Is there an end game for this? Like, do you know sort of what like the best case scenario outcome is from all of this time and investment and this approach that you're taking?
Yeah, well, the main focus is not to get rich. We're not going all Scrooge McDuck with this. And I think that is probably evident in a lot of the decisions that we make. We've talked about profit sharing down the road with, royalties with if we get into ad revenue and that stuff. For us, obviously, our survival long term is going to depend on whether the community wants to support us or not.
Right.
But the key is I don't like asking the community to make the bet or to make the gamble. That's on me. And that's why up front I foot the
Right.
bill so that when you want to actually contribute to us, it's going to actually be more of the model of a street performer that's out there playing music
Right.
and
That's
has
already there. They're already
it's already
doing
there.
their thing. Yeah,
They're
that's
giving it
interesting.
to people and there'll be a tip jar. Hey, if you want to support us, if you enjoyed this, you can contribute. Otherwise, we're just going to be playing our song.
I really like that perspective. It is almost sort of like keeping the lights on approach, right? Which
Yeah.
is that you've made the thing, the art is out there and it's being shared. But
Yep.
if someone then chooses to believe in that and support that in the same way that you do, then the option is there. And I think that's
Absolutely.
probably the key term, right? Is that it's an
Yep.
optional approach. And I'd
Yep.
seen as well, because you've talked very publicly about wanting to expand that IP and that thing beyond the webcomic. And I know that, you had mentioned that there had been other sort of almost spin-off products that you were exploring as well. Is that all kind of tying in with like well, there's a way if you're into board games, if you're into video games or whatever the output is, it's just multiple ways to then support the thing that you believe in. Is that kind of the approach? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, 100%. And it all starts with really the animated series is the flagship to get people familiar with the world and the setting and
Got
the
it.
the IP. And my co-creator, my brother Will, and I both have talked about this, and we're still trying to figure out, hey, how is this going to work? But we are planning on releasing kind of a form of an open license so that other people can create their own stuff, even for profit for themselves. So that
Within
it,
the world of Greasepunk.
yeah, we're trying to figure out what that looks like to make it the least confusing as possible. The other thing is, first you have to get people interested in the world to actually
Yeah,
partake in it. So that's the first hurdle of just getting this out there and getting this whole thing started.
gotcha. I mean, it's such a fascinating reversal of what you typically see from either new IP or anyone in this space. That I've seen ad infinitum versions of this kind of thing on Kickstarter where it
Yep.
doesn't exist. The pitch video is concept art.
Yep.
And then it's like, oh, please help us make this thing.
Yep.
Is it more likely then, obviously I'm not tying you down to this, but like is it more likely that you would go like the Patreon route or the YouTube subs route in terms of a way for a community to support it because it would already exist? It would be about ongoing finance rather than the initial investment, or are you kind of is it too early to talk about that kind of thing?
So the model that I've kind of sketched up just for myself is essentially close to a break-even business model
Right.
where we would have a hybrid approach where, yes, there will be a subscription component if you want, again, the choice,
Yeah.
or you can throw some donations to this episode and that's your choice. Um, but the key is choice across everything. We need to open up doors for people to contribute or support us in any way they can, even if it's not giving money.
Sure.
Just
Sharing, I
sharing
suppose.
and
Yeah.
spreading the word, just
Yeah.
watching the content can help people these days. So the idea is that we want to give a lot of options, and how I kind of view it is a 5 year business plan where right now I'm funding 100%.
Sure.
We'll start to bring revenue streams online, and each year maybe 15-20% starts to get absorbed by this, and we're just gradually getting that runway up towards it.
Yeah.
So
I see.
that kind of a commitment up front on my part really allows something to take root, just like a plant taking root. The seed has to actually grow into something for a
Of
little
course.
bit. And it's of course vulnerable at the beginning, and that's why I have to be, kind of in control of all that at the beginning.
Yeah, and that, I suppose in some ways that does remove the need for it to be immediately profitable out the gate,
Yeah,
right? Because you're not, bills are paid. You're not looking at it from a, oh my, I need this. I think that's often the mistake, isn't it? That like this indie game I'm making or this piece of art that I'm producing has to hit some arbitrary metric in order for me to survive. Because
yep,
you've gone sort of like, the whole all eggs in the basket, which I get that there's value in that approach too, if you know you've got something that's really sticking and really works, but in some ways it's almost like I feel like you've kind of removed the pressure on yourself. It can
yeah,
be the art, right? It's the
yeah,
the thing you're making is then the thing that speaks for itself, which is
yep,
quite an exciting privilege to be able to do that, right?
yeah. Well, and it really, and I think you really hit on a part of it of just being comfortable or taking the stress and the pressure out of it.
Yeah.
And that even spreads to all the people working on the project. I think it's blown me away where people will send me an invoice for something and I'll pay it immediately. They're like, that doesn't happen often.
Well, like
That's
that's the surprise that's
right.
the
And
yeah.
it's like, and that's kind of the whole point where it's like, well, we're not trying to lock in that money to spend for somebody else. We're not spending beyond our means. We're budgeting, it's my budget. so,
No,
so it's
totally.
just
And
being
that
responsible.
I feel like again that unfortunately tends to be the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
And you can only be that agent of change if you're willing to, it's very easy to get on a keyboard. It's very easy to sort of denounce the big publishers and the big developers that are doing it perhaps in the way you wouldn't, but to actually then literally put your money where your mouth is and deliver that. It's to be commended. It's something that I think always really struck me about Greasepunk from the very, very beginning and from the way you've spoken about it. I really appreciate your candor there.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears now, actually, to the thing itself, to the story, and it's. I mean, Greasepunk itself just immediately hooked me. Just like I had the name, it
Awesome.
got my attention. But it definitely it gave me like almost like a Hotline Miami kind of vibe to it, or even like a which in that in itself was inspired by Miami Vice. But it gave me that sort of that really sort of grimy aesthetic, but also not sort of browns and grays. Like it's got a really distinct visual style to it. And are those influences I've assumed, that they way off, or does that in any way connect to kind of the origin of the art and the storytelling for this thing?
No, that's all in there. I think, and it kind of calling back to when I mentioned nostalgia of
Yeah,
things that we've seen in the past, the things that will look familiar. I think that's the key is we're putting so much into this where everyone's going to see a piece of that where they can connect to be like, this reminds me of something I've seen
sure.
before. Um, and that's a big piece of it. I mean, really, the story takes place in the city of Eden, which we've set up as just a fictitious city that really was stood up, that grew incredibly fast. That was its biggest problem, was its success. And so it just experienced massive growth. And so what we're kind of doing in the light of this nostalgia is we're actually not just creating a melting pot of people that flocked to the city. We're actually creating a melting pot of decades. So you will find it
Nice.
takes place in the 60s, but you will actually see things from more the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, all compressed in time because this idea of the city that was stood up grew to such an advanced state for its time. It's well beyond everyone else. And that really lets us look at those nostalgic things from
Mm.
every decade. So
Yeah,
that's the really
nice.
fun part.
And that's very creatively freeing too for you to be able to like you can then dip into a different influence because you know that your premise supports that, right? Which is
Yep.
that's great. The obviously, it doesn't not everything needs to be the MCU, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
does is this sort of like plotted out in terms of like a seasonal structure? Are they standalone episodes? Like what's the kind of the narrative design for this thing?
Yeah. So right now I have outlined in my notes 3 seasons and then a final film that kind of concludes this saga, which is just, it's not necessarily the end of the story or the end of these characters. It's just for this particular part of the story that's going to kick this whole thing off.
Yeah.
It's basically 3 seasons and a final film. We're actually starting with a prologue, which is going to be 4 episodes, ending up to just over an hour long total. And so there'll be kind of 4 releases leading up to wrapping that up, and then we'll combine them again and release kind of a remastered version. But we think of it when I outline stories, I think in terms of groups of characters and story arcs.
Yeah.
So we can have, just like you would in a TV series, you have multiple story arcs going on that kind of are weaving in and out. Sometimes they'll join, sometimes they'll split. We're doing all of that.
Nice.
We're aiming for roughly a 15 to 20 minute release size. We think 15 to 20 minutes is about the right amount of time where you're not asking someone to cut out part of their day. It's,
Right,
they're
right, right.
especially busy people, because I think a lot of people, in their 30s all the way up to their 50s will find things in here they enjoy. And hey, we're all busy. So,
No, I get that. And then it's
yeah,
that again, it's that having to strike a balance between the story you want to tell versus the risk of bloat and it just
yeah.
becoming padded, right? So is that sort of 15, 20 minutes per episode per season? Like what does that look like?
That 15 minutes per episode.
Yeah, nice.
And so every video would be aiming around 15 to 20 minutes. And I could not even tell you how many episodes it'll take in a season.
Okay, that's
Um,
okay, right. Interesting.
we're not trying to, and this is kind of the other side, since, I'm also the producer and I'm not trying to fit it into a box that it has to fit somebody
Nice.
model. We're going to tell the story at the pace that it makes sense so
Yeah,
that it
and that's
stays entertaining.
the freedom of the independence of it, right? Is that you're not tied to a
Yeah.
network's requirements or
Yep.
streaming services budget. Again, you're setting the precedent for this, which is again, it's so freeing creatively because you're not having to either hit some arbitrary number or find yourself the opposite problem, which is that actually they want more and you're having to pad
Yeah.
out or spread
Yep.
out a story's reveals, which is just a nightmare. I I'm a teacher by trade, so I'm a secondary school teacher here in England and teaching drama.
Wow.
And I always write original productions for my students. So we do this every year, and I'm this coming academic year, we're going to attempt our first trilogy. We're going to do a three-part performance set in a sort of original kind of cyberpunk kind of world. And it's going to be told over the course of an academic year. So they'll do
Nice.
3 performances with the same set, same kids, same characters, but three sort of telling a sort of theatrical event over the course of 3 shows. And something that I've found as I've written, I'm probably pushing like 2 dozen youth theatre shows now over the last well, nearly 20 years of doing this. But I found that it's so easy to be influenced by my cast. Like there've been so many times, particularly if I've written anything comedic, there've been so many moments where like one of my students will just blindside me with an improv, or they'll read a line differently that completely changes the meaning of the subsequent dialogue. And I'm sort of happy to be surprised by that, right? Like it's a real creative privilege to have a cast that are that enthusiastic and willing to take risks with your material. And is that given that you've plotted this out, the risk therefore then can be that you've got the 3 seasons in a movie, you've got that narrative structure, even though it's not divided into episodes yet. Are you open to your cast kind of pitching ideas, or at this stage, given that this is all really starting to coalesce and come together, is it easier for them to just stick to the text?
No, it's absolutely open for everything.
Okay.
Everything's on the table. And I'll tell you, even from the casting side, when I write an audition script and an actor teaches me something about the character I didn't know, That's I
Mm.
think if you ask a lot of people that have worked with me thus far, I know Stephen Murray is one example. Like it's I'm really easy to work with. And I really love ad libs, especially
Oh,
because the way
nice.
what I think of characters and really, acting, I think of it as exploring. Like I wrote a character and this is what I think it is. But when the actor is putting on the character and being the character, that takes a little bit more than just reading the script. That's exploring and saying, well, I'm gonna, my script is really about the path, but the actor, they can walk that path differently. They can cut corners along that path. They can, really it's about the direction. The script is, I want to go in that direction. Sometimes they can take a different path to that direction, and that's fine. Um,
Right. Okay.
I I cannot stress enough that this is something I look for in actors is I look for people that try to explore a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
and be willing to play. I think too, that's
yeah,
something that I definitely had moments like that where, even down to like, I mean, live theater slightly different because it obviously involves things like costuming, but even down to things like that, like, oh, could my character have this, or could I? And typically, what I'll say to my students is like, I'd rather you try it and then we edit than you be too inhibited to take a risk and therefore a moment could have missed or an
yeah,
opportunity might not have been explored. And
yep,
that I always sort of find, and that typically has led to some really fun surprises. Like
yeah,
I like being not precious about my own script, right? Like
yeah,
I don't feel a need for them to be like this isn't Shakespeare. Like,
right.
I'm happy for you to have some to embellish, have some fun with it.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way because and I think I actually mentioned this in like our audition packs and stuff. I'm not married to any of our scripts.
Mm,
I like that as a framework to start for the playtime. So it's
yeah.
you kind of work with the scene, work with the characters. I think for me, even after casting, I tell you, I just rewrote episode 2 of the prologue because after casting the characters in it, it was almost like I need to tailor some of these to the actors' strengths, the things that
Interesting.
they just shine. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that.
Oh, that's
That's
interesting. 'Cause it
how,
wasn't something specific necessarily, but their sort of like general approach to the character
yeah,
informed your writing.
yeah. Stephen Murray was the first one that really did that and just knocked my socks off because for the
Nice.
character of Max, I did not envision the performances that he gave, and I
Yeah.
now have a completely different understanding of the character.
And what a privilege, right? That's what a
Yeah,
pleasure to be able
yeah,
to have that. And again, shout out to Stephen. Who we we're very fortunate to have him involved with Burly Media. Do we get to pick his brain on a regular basis on one of our podcast dulcet tones? So yeah, no, I hear you on that. I hear you
yeah.
on that for sure. No, shout out to him. But I think that does speak to a really sort of great point within this approach to what you're doing, which is that this idea that you are truly creating something that is led by you. You are putting up the quite literal investment, but also that you're allowing your actors to play and you're allowing this process to evolve. Is that something where going forward, does that extend into those other elements of the company, or will you want to retain a little bit more creative control as the brand starts to spread its wings a little bit?
And I think I think it is going to be uh, more flexible. And then that's when I mentioned like the open source license
Mm,
aspect of it. That's where we're trying to figure that out, materialize that, and say these specifically are the things that we want people to pick up and take in a different direction or do something with. And right now, I think a lot of it has to do with the city and the setting. A lot of factions and things like that that we will build and begin to work with, and then we'll just throw that to people and say, "Hey, go make stuff.
what do you want to
Do
do with
what
this?
you want." Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And that's I've as a gamer, I've always been very frustrated by companies like Nintendo who become very possessive and protective of their IP and can make it really untenable for a
Yeah,
lot of fans to produce things and original work. I get that they want to protect a legacy, but equally, for those that are legitimately just wanting to share their own take on something. It can be very disheartening, I think, for a lot of people. And I know that the Paramount with the Star Trek universe is very similar. They became very, very iron-fisted with in terms of like fan productions and things like that, which is where a lot of those things have now long since disappeared. So I think anything that even just in a 2% way addresses that paradigm and gives people a chance to really open up their creativity and engage with something new, it's only something that should be celebrated, and it's really exciting. So, John, where can people find you? Where can they find out more about Greasepunk Paradise?
Well, we got a website, greasepunkparadise.com. We're most active, I would say, on Twitter or X, which I
Mhm.
believe we're Greasepunk Comic on that platform. Otherwise, yeah, you know, come follow us, shout out. We post pretty much every day on either the website or our Twitter account.
Fantastic. And I don't know whether you intended this, but you've got really dramatic lighting going on right now, which is sort of like very Greasepunk of you.
I did not intend that. That is my desktop. I just closed all the windows.
Well, I mean, the happiest of accidents can only lead to a good thing. So, folks, thank you so much for tuning in to this latest episode of Some Drivel. You can find us at Burly Bird Media on all of the things. That is Facebook, Threads, Instagram, as well as YouTube, Podbean, and Spotify, where these episodes go up. You can also come and join our Discord community, again, at Burly Bird Media. It's a really welcoming, fun, collaborative place where people can share stuff they're working on, discuss games, films, etc. And we always have various sort of live shows and podcasts and things happening there. So please do consider jumping in and checking it out. John, thank you so much for giving up your time and talking with me today. And folks, we will see you next time.